And now, I would like to introduce Reverend Michael Dowd. And, realizing I failed to research this before to do this introduction. So I'm looking at my phone on Wikipedia, guys. But I knew this. Um, Reverend Michael Dowd. He is an American progressive Christian minister, author, and eco-theologian, known as an advocate of big history, religious naturalism, sustainability, climate activism, and the epic of evolution. And I could read on and on and on, but we'd rather hear him speak live. So I will leave it to that. And who knows, maybe Wikipedia doesn't have it all right. But I do know he's done some TED Talks and he's written some wonderful books. And welcome, Reverend Michael Dowd. We're so glad you're here.
Great. Thank you, Reverend Della. So I'm going to share my screen here, if I could. Oops, I've got the chat right in front of me here. That's interesting. Okay, there we go. So, beyond hope and fear, clarity, compassion, courageous love and action. The first thing I want to say before I share some slides is that we are living in a time when all of us, whatever our beliefs, our philosophy, our backgrounds, we're all experiencing the stress and the craziness of living in this time. And that's why I so appreciated earlier, Reverend Delth, when you talked about not just striving for peace, but being peace for others, spreading peace by how we are. And I really see that as the essence of what New Thought principles, spiritual principles are about. I like this quote from Hannah Arendt. Hope is a dangerous barrier to acting courageously in dark times. In hope, the soul overreaches or overleaps reality, as in fear, it shrinks back from it. I recommend living in a hope-free zone, neither hopeful nor hopeless. In fact, I'm quite interested in the death doula thing that Reverend Annie, you talked about, so I'll be in touch with you about that. I'd probably like to go through that process myself. I love this quote from famous death worker, Grief Walker. There's a documentary on Stephen Jenkinson's work called Grief Walker that's fabulous. He says, grief requires us to know the time we're in. The great enemy of grief is hope. Hope is the four-letter word for people who are unwilling to know things for what they are. Our time requires us to be hope-free, to burn through the false choice of being hopeful or hopeless. They are two sides of the same con job. Grief is required to proceed. And my great mentor, Joanna Macy, says, the depth of your grief is the measure of your love. You would not be feeling grief if you didn't love. So I'd like to speak about three things related to this topic of beyond hope and fear, because we will inevitably bounce back and forth. Hope and fear go together like two sides of a coin. And so we'll keep bouncing back and forth between those if we don't have an understanding of reality, like why things are like they are and why things are in the mess they are, and an acceptance, because awareness is a booby prize. Only acceptance can transform lives. So clarity, compassion, and courageous love and action. Because without this understanding of reality, God's time, God's nature, and God's love, without grounding our heart and our minds in God's time, that is reality's time, reality's nature, and the love of reality as a whole, then we're going to not have clarity, we're going to have confusion. And instead of compassion, we're going to be in the blame game. And then courageous love and action. I prefer that to activism. So let me just take these quickly at just one at a time. God's time. Again, I use the word, the earth emoji, because what I'm talking about is nothing less than our biophysical, living creator, sustainer, and end, which transcends the universe, but it includes the universe. It includes the earth. So on this time scale, every decade is 1.4 billion years. This is the whole history of the universe, 13.82 billion years. Every week is 2.8 million years. Each day on the cosmic century timeline, on God's time, is 400,000 years. Each minute, 250 years. And every second is just under 5 years. And so here we see, we're not used to thinking of this, we think of this as secular, but no, this is God's time. This is the nature of reality. We have the early galaxies happening here, supernovas and red giants. I do whole programs where I go into all this in great depth. But our solar system emerges at 67 on this 100-year time scale. The oceans, basically the Earth cools below the boiling point of water and it rains for eons and the oceans were formed. Bacteria, first emerging under the ground or in the deep hot vents and then coming to life. And then photosynthesis is where some of these bacteria learn to feed on the photons of the sun. And then we've got this whole process of biological evolution. But human history, where is human history? Well, human history is just the last day. You've got 90, okay, if the beginning of the universe is 1 second after midnight of the year 0, and right now it's December 31st of the 99th year, just about to go into the 100th year, right at midnight, on that time scale, Homo habilis, walking upright using stone tools the last week. We domesticated fire in the last day and a half, and we've only been speaking in symbolic language, words, for the last day on a 100-year time scale. So God's time, the past isn't behind us. The past isn't to our left or our right. The past is within us. In fact, I remember a physicist once saying, if you want to know where the whole universe began, put your hands like this, right there. 14 billion years ago, 13.82 billion years ago, right there, right? That's where the universe began. Right? DNA is the past living in us. It's our ancestors living in us, both human and pre-human. But God's nature is also, just like nesting dolls. We've got our microbiome, individuals, ecosystems, this nested nature of the divine. I love this nesting doll analogy because it helps me understand that the nature of reality is nested and that we're in the middle somewhere. We're made up of smaller, creative, intelligent realities that we can't live without. And we're part of and dependent upon larger, creative, intelligent realities that we can't live without. That's what I call primary reality. Primary reality is everything inside us and everything outside us that we don't exist without. And Martin Buber, the famous Jewish theologian, talked about if we don't have an I-thou, a personal, intimate relationship with what I'm calling primary reality, that is our living creator, sustainer, and end, if we don't have a personal relationship, we're going to cause our own extinction. And that's exactly what we're in the process of doing, because we have been treating nature as a clock. And God we trivialized as the clockmaker outside a clockwork universe. And if you believe in the clockmaker, you're a theist. And if you disbelieve in the clockmaker, you're an atheist. And both sides treat the living, pulsing presence of the divine in and through the biosphere, in and through the universe, as merely it to be related to, not a thou to be honored. So every indigenous culture, every truly sustainable culture had what I call an eco-theo worldview, where the ecos was related to as divine, and the theos, the world of spirit, was infused, embodied, embedded, incarnate, dwelling within the living world. And this is a fundamental truth. Primary reality must be honored as primary. Otherwise, we cause untold problems. Gaia would be enough, except if you have a concept of God that's outside, and then it's not enough. So that's why I've been, for the last several years, spelling God G, Earth emoji D, because visually it sounds the same, or auditorily it sounds the same, God, but when you visually, you realize immediately you're not talking about merely an otherworldly entity who lives off the planet and outside the universe, who blesses some and smites others. No, we're talking about reality with a personality. So really, ecology is the heart of my theology. That's this eco-theism. I'm an eco-theologian. This is fundamental. Sustainable means faithful to God. Unsustainable means unfaithful to God. And I suggest that everything else is but a footnote or a distraction. That's why what we mean by the word God matters so much. If we mean by God simply an otherworldly entity, then we can have the delusion that we can trash the environment or treat others in an unjust way and still be faithful to God. No, that's a total delusion. So truly sustainable means faithful to the past, faithful to the ancestors, faithful to the descendants, that's the whole seventh generation, and faithful to the body of life upon which we depend in every possible way. God's love. What do we mean by God's love? Is this only something ethereal or spiritual in an otherworldly sense? No, I suggest not. But this is a God's eye view of the world, the view from within every set of eyes, the subjective experience of every creature has got to be included in whatever we mean by a God's eye view of the world. It's not just the view from above and outside it all, it's the subjective consciousness from within every creature. So God's love includes the entire love of the cosmos. Every creature that's capable of feeling love is a subset of the love of the whole, the love of reality as a whole, all of that. It's incarnational. I share this slide because one of the things that this helps us do is have compassion for ourselves and each other. There are 9 universally recognized human needs. That is, these needs are necessary for us to be sane. Basically, all humans, all cultures throughout all of human history. And I originally got this from Dave Pollard, who builds it on a lot of other scholars. But the first need that we need, obviously, is a habitable climate and healthy, non-toxic air, water, food, and shelter. It's a human universal need. The need to belong to and connect with a safe and engaging community, starting with attachment to one's mother in the critical first years of life. The need for meaning and purpose in one's life, including meaningful work. The need to be valued, appreciated, and heard. The need to feel secure about the future for oneself and one's loved ones. The need for control and a degree of autonomy over one's life and work. The need to be in regular, intimate communion with the living world, with God, with Gaia. The need for a sense of place and home. And the need for freedom from chronic stress, financial, physical, etc., and the time and space to recover from it, including getting adequate sleep. Now, the first thing to notice about this list is that in truly sustainable cultures, in pro-future cultures, in cultures that live faithful to the past, faithful to the future, and faithful to the body of life, all of these were met in spades. But in civilizations, and I say plural because a lot of people don't know there's over 100 civilizations, and they've all overshot their carrying capacities. I'll say more about that, but these are not typically met in agricultural civilizations, and they're surely not met for most people in industrial civilization. Now, this is going to be painful to hear, so just sort of fasten your seatbelt. The stability of the biosphere has been in decline for centuries and in unstoppable, out-of-control mode for decades. This great acceleration of Gaian collapse is an easily verifiable fact. The scientific evidence is overwhelming. In fact, all you've got to do is Google great acceleration, and you'll find all these charts that show this. Evidence is also compelling that the vast majority of people will deny this, especially those still benefiting from the existing order, those legitimately concerned about the consequences of collapse, and those who fear that accepting reality means giving up. And yes, that's virtually all of us are in that paragraph somewhere. The history of more than 80 previous boom and bust, progress, regress societies reveals how and why Homo colossus is taking its own life. Homo colossus is the term that my great mentor, William Catton, gave to industrial civilization. Homo colossus is where each of us that are part of industrial civilization uses 20 to 50 times the resources and exudes 20 to 50 times the waste as Homo sapiens. Paradoxically, faith, trust, acceptance may be the only thing that can help us remain sane, loving, and able to collapse with dignity and grace. So I mentioned that the evidence suggests that most people will be in denial. So let's get clear about what does denial mean, because denial gets a bad rap. Denial is actually often just healthy, adaptive inattention. So denial is the largely unconscious habit of thought, whereby we refuse to accept the reality of things that are bad or upsetting, or that challenge our worldview, our legacy, how we live, what is required of us, and or our feelings of self-worth or superiority. Denial is also the instinctual impulse to reject or discount information that calls into question our hopes, assumptions, or expectations about the future. I have denial instincts. You have denial instincts. Everybody we know and love has denial instincts for very good evolutionary reasons. So we can have compassion for ourselves and each other. I love this one. I've heard of denial, but I just don't believe in it. Burying my head in the sand over climate change is much easier now that half the world has turned to desert. It's not denial. I'm just very selective about the reality I accept. Or who of us can't relate to this one? My desire to be well informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. So again, another quote from Stephen Jenkinson. Inattention, that is not paying attention to the world's ecological state, is well advised because attention to it mitigates against your happiness, your contentment, and your sense of well-being. Having a conscience now is a grief-soaked proposition. Whatever spiritual awakening may have meant in past times and places, if you awaken in our time, you awaken with a sob. This is a piece of history that most of us don't know. And when we do know it, we can find our confusion is replaced with clarity and our blame is replaced with compassion. Collapse, it turns out, is a feature of all human-centered rather than God-centered or life-centered or Gaia-centric or ecocentric civilizations. For example, just a few years ago, the BBC had a special series on deep civilization. And Luke Kemp wrote an article called, "Are We on the Road to Civilization Collapse?" And of course, he answered yes. And he has this chart that shows 88 ancient civilizations, just between 3,000 of before the Common Era and 1,000 of the Common Era, just that 4,000-year period. If you go back before 3000 BCE, or if you look at the last 1,000 years, it's well over 100. And it turns out that great civilizations, as the famous 20th century historian Arnold Toynbee noted, great civilizations are not murdered. They take their own life. And we actually know how. How human-centered civilizations consistently commit ecocide or suicide. And this is just the last 5% of human history. Last 8,000 years, roughly 400 generations, as opposed to 20,000 generations in terms of living more or less sustainably, that is more or less faithful to God, faithful to life. And we have over 80 examples. This typically takes about 225 to 325 years. We see a time of progress, rise, boom, at least for the elite, not necessarily for the slaves in slave societies. Then there's this whole process overshooting the carrying capacity. That is, we use more resources. It's really overshooting the grace limits. It's not honoring the grace limits of the living world. There's a grace that is lost if we take too much or we exude too much waste. So that's, in secular language, called overshooting the carrying capacity. And then there's a process of regress or fall or bust that usually happens much faster. And this is an unstoppable process of collapse. There's not a civilization in human history that has ever been able to become sustainable on the way down. It can't be done for totally well-known reasons, but most people in today's world think that it can be done. And our inner world, our feelings and our expectations is so different. If we're born and we die in times of expansion, in times of progress, in times of carrying capacity surplus, then of course you expect your kids and grandkids are going to have it easier or wealthier or better than you. And if you're born and die in times of fall, in times of regress, in times of decline, which usually takes many decades, sometimes a century or more, well, of course your kids and grandkids are going to have it more tough than you. It's just the way things are. It's when you're born in times of expansion and it shifts in your lifetime, that's what we call suffering. And that's where all of us are right now. A good measure of how much in denial a person is their response to this movie, Don't Look Up. Connie and I watched it last night for, I think, the 9th or 10th time. We consider it a profound example of gallows humor because the comet actually is heading our way. We ourselves set it in motion millennia ago, but only recently have scientists, echoing longstanding indigenous warnings, charted its course and voiced the alarm. Its name, the comet that's hitting us, is anthropocentrism. In religious language, idolatry. And these are the end times because human-centeredness, as opposed to God-centeredness, life-centeredness, will prove to be just as unstoppable and nearly as deadly as the comet in the movie. Neil deGrasse Tyson famously said when he watched Don't Look Up, he said, "It seems like a documentary to me." So it's important that we support each other in honoring. There's just no way to take this information in, unless you totally stay in denial, but there's no way to take this in without feeling grief. Grief is actually a blessing. It's important to honor the stages of grief and sadness, climate grief, expectations. If you're a young person, it's the death of dreams that you need to, or you're grieving for. So we see this process, Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining. If we all just get solar panels, if we all just get wind turbines, if we have a Green New Deal, that's the bargaining stage. Depression, when you realize that technology in the market can't save us from what technology in the market caused in the first place. And then finally, acceptance. And then if we allow ourselves to stay in that, we can find the gift. That's why my life has now been devoted into the realm of post-doom. Unfortunately, you can't get to post-doom. I call it resurrection theology. It's compost theology. It's what happens on the other side of doom. You can't get to post-doom without going through doom. So you can't short circuit it. But then we can find generous love and action. And I prefer love and action to activism, because activism is often still fear-based, and it's often still very judgmental. Where generous love and action is often local, and it's where you get to be compassionate. You get to be hope for others. You're not trying to cling to hope. You're being hope for others. And then, as I mentioned, gallows humor. It's just vital to nurture that. If you haven't gotten to the place of gallows humor, you're probably driving yourself crazy. I mean, when I look at the news now, because I've been studying this stuff for the last 9 years, it doesn't land like a dagger, because I understand the rise and fall of civilization. So now when I read about the craziness that's happening in the political world and the economic craziness and the climate craziness and everything else, I'm more likely to reach for the popcorn, because it's like, oh, of course. This is how empires collapse. This is how civilizations collapse. Of course. So the clarity replaces what I did have, confusion, before I understood this stuff, and blame just evaporates, and compassion replaces blame. And there are certain benefits. I'll conclude on this note. There are certain benefits that occur only when we truly can accept and trust what is inevitable. In fact, the most important program that I've delivered or created in the last several years is called 10 Inevitables, Post-Doom, No Gloom. So these are just a few of the benefits, because, as I mentioned before, awareness by itself is a booby prize. Awareness can be hell, but acceptance, trust in the process can bring about tremendous joy. So we see clarity over confusion, compassion over blame, and love in action replaces desperation. This post-doom perspective reprioritizes nearly everything around what matters most and what doesn't. It's kind of like we've all been given a terminal diagnosis. Not that each one of us will die in the next 10 years, but we're part of Homo colossus. We're part of a dead man walking. We're part of a collective entity called Homo colossus that is absolutely going extinct. That may or may not mean Homo sapiens goes extinct. It certainly is a possibility, but we're all part of that. So we can reprioritize around what really matters and what really doesn't. A calm urgency to get complete with self, family, others, life, and legacy. This urgency, a calm urgency to get complete, to make sure that if somebody died in your life, say tomorrow or tonight, that you're not left with, oh, I never apologized, or I never told them what a blessing they had been to my life, or I'd never cleaned up that stuff or whatever. So getting complete. Focusing attention on home, family, community. What's local? What's joyful? What's meaningful? Just because we can't save everything doesn't mean that there's not a tremendous amount of great work that we can do, and in a way that's soul nourishing to ourselves and to others. Freedom from shoulds, oughts, have tos, and freedom for coulds, might, get tos. Often an overwhelming gratitude for the gift of simply being alive and aware and able to feel deeply. I mean, one of the things we know, that 2022 is going to be a hard year. We could begin to see this could very well be, and I suspect it actually probably will be, the first year that human population doesn't grow, but begins to decline, because I think we will see famines around the world this year. It only takes 3 of the 5 major grain growing regions of the world. If 2 or more fail in the same year, which could easily happen this year, you're looking at 500 million to 1 billion people dying. And that absolutely is likely to happen this decade, if not this year. And then an expanded sense of self, this identity that your self doesn't stop with your skin. I know this is not news to people that are in unity and religious science and centers for spiritual living and interfaith context, new thought context. This is core to who we are. But this is news to a lot of your friends and neighbors. This identity, this you're as large as the universe, that your larger body encompasses the whole of time and space. And recognizing that death is not a problem. Death is not the enemy, that death and even extinctions are an integral part of life. So this is the realm that my post-doom website, I've had 80 conversations at postdoom.com, tons of resources. Here are the 3 definitions of doom and post-doom, and I'll conclude on this. Doom is a normal feeling of disgust or dread upon realizing that technological progress and economic growth and development are the root of our predicament, not our way out. Doom is a name for the anxiety and fear called forth when living in a corrupt, dysfunctional civilization, causing a mass extinction. And doom is the midpoint between denial and regeneration. With or without us, life will regenerate. That's why I call it compost theology. That's what life does. Resurrection isn't just what happened to one God-man 2,000 years ago. It's a part of the nature of nature. Post-doom is what opens up when we remember who we are, that we're part of the body of God, we're part of the body of the universe. We'll remember who we are, accept the inevitable, honor our grief, and prioritize what is pro-future and soul-nourishing. Post-doom is a fierce and fearless reverence for life and relative equanimity, even in the midst of abrupt climate mayhem, a global pandemic, and collapse of both the health of the biosphere and business as usual. And post-doom is living meaningfully, compassionately, and courageously, no matter what. So twice a week, actually 4 times a week, we have 2 women's circles. These are all freely available. You just, on that page, I have post-doom, no gloom Zoom calls where we have 20 or 30 people, sometimes 40 people. So that's there. And then these are resources that I can talk about later that are all about adapting and accepting reality. In fact, this one titled Beyond Hope and Fear, Clarity, Compassion, Courageous Love and Action, it's the same title as this sermon, but it's probably about 70% different. So if you want to know how I've also used this title and done different stuff. And then the new Serenity Prayer, emotional support for climate anxiety and environmental dread. And I'll conclude with the Serenity Prayer that most of us are familiar with, but may not be familiar with the final line. God, life, reality, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as the pathway to peace. I get that last line, accepting hardship as the pathway to peace. I see the heart of unity, religious science, new thought principles. It's sometimes misunderstood. Sometimes people think that it means that if I just have the right beliefs, the universe, like a slot machine, is going to make all good things happen. No, that's not at all. Basically, my understanding of the heart of new thought is that whatever is real, whatever truly occurs, whatever reality really shows up as, I can be positive. I can be loving. It's too late for some things, but it's not too late for almost everything that makes life meaningful, that makes life important. It's certainly not too late to be a loving person. It's not too late to be a loving, compassionate, generous contribution to your community. And when we are in that place, we be hope for others. We be peace for others. We spread hope and peace. And we do so in a way that gives us clarity rather than confusion, compassion rather than blame, and we can support each other in being courageously in action, love in action. Thank you.